In the course of the early stages of one's creative process, it is not uncommon to come to the conclusion that the best setting for a given work of fiction is the one in which both writer and audience are immersed at every moment of every day. The genuine article of human history, but for a few key adjustments. Entire genres, from alternate history to historical fantasy, have been formed around this concept, distinguished between each other primarily by the degree to which they adhere to events as they actually occurred. One of the most integral elements of such a work, as one would expect, is a working knowledge of the time period being utilized, which brings us to the purpose of this little exercise: anachronism. Firstly, allow me to clarify that my usage of the term is in the most literal possible sense, being defined simply as something within the work which does not mesh with the historical context of the setting. Ultimately, there are two major types of anachronism that are relevant to what I'm attempting to cover, namely accidental and intentional. The first of the two, the greatest stumbling block in using any form of historical context in a work of fiction, and the cause of at least 3 mental breakdowns a year on the part of history majors the world over, is accidental anachronism. This generally manifests as instance of date mismatch, with events appearing out of sequence. Just to supply a hypothetical, February 14th, 1961. Several members of the Sicilian Mafia are apprehended by police in connection with a local protection racket. They prepare to stand trial, spinning bizarre tales of being followed by a so-called hungry shadow to interrogators in an apparent stalling tactic. The investigators elect to ignore these obvious fabrications, filing to charge the group under the Racketeer-Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, only to find the erstwhile leader of the group missing from his cell the following morning, save for a few bones and a pool of dried blood. Aside from the obvious, this would be entirely plausible were it not for the unfortunate fact that the aforementioned act wouldn't be signed into law for another 9 years, and moreover wouldn't actually be written until the following year. Dates are dangerous. Even if the vast majority of your audience either doesn't notice or doesn't care, someone will put 2 and 2 together and you'll never hear the end of it. If you decide you want to use a particular date, you will need to undergo that most arduous, Herculean of tasks: research. Shock horror. In all seriousness, get as much information as you can conceivably access. No one will begrudge you for not just knowing everything off the top of your head. And besides, you may find some particular inspiration you wouldn't otherwise have encountered. A great deal of the complexity that can be introduced into any attempt at historical research can be a specificity of terminology. For instance, there is a considerable difference between when a particular piece of technology was, strictly speaking, invented, and when it entered widespread production and usage. Even with the best of research, certain specifics have simply been lost to the ages, but it is often this ambiguity that a writer will find themselves with the most room to maneuver, so to speak. Established fictional settings present all the same potential difficulties, if not more, as the history of the world may be tucked away in a catalog of individual installments so expansive as to make the likes of Terry Pratchett blush. Significant events may have been retroactively changed in the most counterintuitive conceivable manner, causing even the simplest piece of information to be mired in uncertainty. Not to worry, though. The setting's diehard fans, who have taken the years necessary to pore over every slightest nuance of the world's history and internal concepts, will most assuredly let you know about any inaccuracies, repeatedly, for the rest of your life. Now, all jokes aside, fictional histories also present a unique advantage to the writer, Namely, that not a soul will be able to find something more closely approximating a primary source, provided you put the effort in. Which, depending on the specific instance, may be a great deal easier said than done. However, given that you are fond enough of the setting in question to set your own work within it, you are likely something of a diehard fan yourself, and thus you've almost certainly developed at least a functional degree of familiarity with it. Furthermore, it is also imperative to recognize that bridging off of the work of another writer necessitates that you afford your erstwhile predecessor at least some cursory degree of respect, as well as maintaining some element of reverence for the preceding work itself, refraining from making pointless, sweeping changes to the original continuity. After all, such a course of action would almost invariably guarantee the veritable decimation of the existing audience, as people who are invested in the elements which were changed show themselves out as vocally as possible. But surely no one would do that, not seeing the inevitable result coming from a mile away at least. After all, that would require a consistent strain, patent narcissism, as well as an absolute breakdown of one's basic faculties of cause-effect reasoning and pattern recognition. Let's all be thankful we live in a world where such absurdity does not occur. And may some besooted imbecile wrest a project away from its original creator and slap it down on my desk sight unseen, expecting the same result for less of an investment because he's long since lost the ability to form a solitary thought that doesn't take on the form of a spreadsheet if I'm wrong. Ultimately, there are two types of writers that work within established settings. Those who do their best to keep up with the constant game of retcon leapfrog, but might make an entirely understandable mistake here and there, and those who don't bother at all. Be one of the former rather than the latter, and you will probably not get drawn and quartered, in purely metaphorical fashion, I assure you, by the aforementioned diehards. All of the potential pitfalls aside, making intentional use of anachronistic elements can provide enough of a what-if hook to keep the requisite vice grip on the audience's attention. Whether it's the appearance of an as-of-yet-not-invented technology, or a character making an unguarded reference to events which have yet to occur, using anachronism to generate intrigue, when executed effectively, can be an indispensable tool to create some overwhelmingly engaging plot developments. The most readily apparent key to this course of action is thus: if something is supposed to be unusual, it must be explicitly established as such. This may be as simple as a few snippets of dialogue of a "what the hell is that" bent, or as steeped in meta-narrative as another character dismissing as an impossibility that which the audience knows to be inevitable. Of course, the latter may worry some as it relies on the foreknowledge of the audience, but provided the specifics of the time period have been adequately established, as well as any changes made within the work itself, the writer has some leeway in this regard. Likewise, the deliberate changes made by the writer may take on the form of adjusting actual occurrences, at least in a speculative circumstance. Though one must be quite careful with this as well, as specific instances may come across as being in poor taste. As for the horror genre specifically, intentional anachronism serves a singular purpose, aside from granting an initial basis by which to establish expectations, to essentially unseat the audience, to knock them off kilter and keep them wondering what the writer's next move will be. However, something which I have been overwhelmingly intrigued by is the notion of making use of historical uncertainties, where sources are unreliable or non-existent, long fodder for speculation of all sorts. The shadows cast in the annals of history are often the darkest our world has to offer, no embellishment required. In making use of these unknowns, one simultaneously evades the dangers of historical inaccuracy and takes advantage of one of mankind's oldest and most bandied about fears. From the many periods of record-precluding chaos that have near universally surrounded human conflict, to the many centuries, if not millennia, of knowledge lost to mere chance, the opportunities are something approaching endless.